1986 by Hu Shi, one of China's leading reformers. And our mission is that we aim to deepen understanding of China here in the United States through the pillars of arts and culture, education. Arts and culture, we have this wonderful gallery, and by the way, it's going to be open after tonight's talk as well, so please take a look. Hi. We've got a wonderful exhibit that basically this talk is very closely related to this show, which is about the art of the mountain, and so we thought it would be contemporary photography. And we thought that the art of the mountain is very much related to the search for China's soul, and this moment in Chinese history right now where China has 40 years of development, rapid development, and is, I think, very much looking for meaning and who are we and where are we going as a society. So we're delighted to have this book coming out today. So arts and culture, education, we have a school of Chinese studies. We teach children and adults here. And then we also do business dialogue. And we just recently had a big executive summit with 250 people, and Hank Paulson speaking, and Joseph Stiglitz, and a bunch of Chinese CEOs talking. So we do a whole range of things. We're thrilled to have you here, and really delighted to have Yvonne Wong, one of our wonderful trustees, here tonight. And do I see any other trustees here tonight? I think, Yvonne, thank you for coming. And let me just do a quick introduction. We're talking tonight about a new book that is just coming out called Mount Wutai, Visions of a Sacred Buddhist Mountain, which was written by Wen-shing Chou. And she's going to be joined in conversation by Gray Tuttle, who is a leading expert on Tibetan Buddhism at Columbia University. Wen-shing teaches art history at Hunter College at CUNY, and she specializes in Buddhist art of China and the Himalayas, with her research focusing on the relationship between religion and empiricism in early modern and modern periods and the intersection of history, geography, and biography in Buddhist traditions. So she's going to start by talking for a few minutes about her new book, which is a beautiful, we hope they're for sale here. It's a beautiful coffee table book with beautiful photographs. And then Gray and I will join her on stage to have a kind of a conversation. She's brought lots of photographs, which she'll be sharing with us as well. So come on up, Wen-shing. And, or Wen-shing, I don't know if you want comfortable standing up here, or, yeah, let's hear it. And so you need this, which I believe is on. There you go.
Should I use this? Do I need a microphone, or
Yeah.
I think yes.
Yeah.
Great if you can.
Is this on? Oh. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes? Can you all hear me? Thank you so much.
And make sure it's on. So
I didn't turn up fully on. Can you make this better?
Is the green light on?
No, the green light is on. Yes, thank you so much, Dina, for the introduction. I want to thank you, and also Aaron and staff of the China Institute for so kindly hosting this event. I'm very fond of the China Institute, mostly through my teaching so far. When the China Institute used to be in this old location, is it 63rd? 55th. It's so close. We used to walk down the street all the time. But now, even now that we're not far away, every time there's a new exhibit, I bring my whole class over and we do everything. I just really appreciate the resources. And just feel very close to the Institute, even though it's my first time here talking about the book and talking. I come here very often, and I'm really grateful for all that you do. So today I'm here to talk a little bit about this a new book that I wrote, and hopefully I'd love to have a conversation. I'm looking forward to a conversation with the rest of you. So this book is on the Sacred Mountain range of Mount Wutai, which is, I have a map here, gives you approximate location. It's
it won't work on the screen. Right, okay, so you can see that. I have to do the work. So it's the location is in present-day Shanxi province, on the northern, located in the sort of changing frontiers of northern China. historically. So as you can see in this map, there are many, and also as you walk through the exhibit, there are many sacred sacred mountain ranges in China, Buddhist and otherwise. I think what distinguishes Mount Wutai from others is that ever since around 7th, 8th century, when it already was a very prominent sacred mountain, it was a site of international pilgrimage. Pilgrims from all over Buddhist Asia were coming to Mount Wutai. And
hold it a little closer to your mouth.
sure,
Yeah, okay.
this is okay.
Yeah, that's much better.
Okay,
Like
great.
a rock star.
That's right. So it's a kind of unique in the sense that not only is it a very the preeminent sacred Buddhist mountain range, the sort of longest, the mountain that has been sort of in continuous worship for the longest time of all Buddhist mountain ranges, but also that it's a site of international pilgrimage and sort of a center of a network of places in Buddhist Asia. And so the book that I wrote is focused on the period of the 17th through the 19th century, when the site became an important place for Tibetan Buddhism. And so going back to this idea of it being an international pilgrimage site, one of the reasons, I think there are many reasons, but one of the reasons why the site became such an important site for Buddhists of different sects, different traditions, different places is the fact that Mount Wutai is understood across Buddhist traditions to be the dwelling place of the Buddhist deity of wisdom. And we usually, I will refer to this deity by its Sanskrit name, Manjushri. So not only is the site understood to be where Manjushri is dwelling, but also that Manjushri will manifest, will appear to pilgrims who go to Mount Wutai on pilgrimage. And Manjushri is known to appear in the most sort of unsuspecting pilgrims in the most unexpected ways, perhaps as a local beggar woman, as many of the lores will tell us, but also as miraculous play of light and cloud, something that perhaps Gray will talk about a little bit later with his pictures, or as any kind of, it could be people, sites, or entire monasteries manifested. So really, if we think about what makes this mountain sacred, it's not the rocks or the sort of mountain itself per se, although they manifest the numinous qualities of this deity. But it's the ability, once you go there, to be able to see Manjushri in the various manifestations. So this then lends itself to be able to fit into various Buddhist traditions, because the various forms the deities might take on, the various notions of what a deity is, can all be accommodated with these various different manifestations. And so that's something that becomes also important in the period that I work on in the 17th and 19th century, when the rulers of China at the time, the Qing Manchu rulers, who having conquered China from north of the Great Wall, very heavily promoted Tibetan Buddhism, and they promoted Mount Wutai, Tibetan Buddhism on Mount Wutai. They also proclaimed themselves to be emanations of Manjushri. So they are sort of the ruling Manjushri, sort of presiding over this mountain that is in northeastern China, over the whole sort of Buddhist universe. And so that's the topic of the book. The question of how to think about this period, how to tell the story of this period when the site, owing to the patronage of the Manchu rulers, became a thriving Tibetan Buddhist site, is a question that I had been thinking about. And in my book, what I try to do is to tell that story through objects, through the material culture of pilgrimage. Because there are numerous textual sources, but they tell you what it is, but that, I think somehow as an art historian, that picture doesn't fully really kind of manifest without lots of objects that could tell that story I think in many ways even better than sort of historical sources can. But by objects, I include in my book also textual objects as well, guidebooks and so on. And so let me just show you. I think I need to point to somewhere else. Where should I point?
Where's the computer?
Hold on a second.
Oh, there's the I didn't point, it just was a little slow. And so I just want to show you one of the objects. There are many things, if you have a chance to look at the book, there are any number of things that I talk about in different chapters. One of the things that started me on this project were maps, were pilgrimage maps, popular pilgrimage maps like this one. It's pretty large. It's about almost twice the size of the screen in reality, so it's a fairly big woodblock print. So it's a woodblock print that was then later hand colored that depicts. As you can see, even its kind of shrunken down form, not only temples, but also a lot of miraculous happenings. You can see all the different clouds here, various apparitions, miracles that were happening. I show you this picture from 2006 that I took of the Taipei Valley to give you a sense of how not only is this map a kind of map of visions, right? So we talked about how people went to Mount Wutai not just to climb this mountain, but really for vision quests. So this map has not only the sort of coverage of where each previous vision took place, but also a fairly kind of close correspondence to the site itself. You can see this, what is called a Great White Stupa here, down in the center of what is known as the Taipei Valley. And this is a picture taken from one of the higher hills, looking at the Taipei Valley of that very stupa. So here's another closer up of the stupa that is very iconic of the place as well. So I just like to think, I wanted to write a book of this history through objects, because when I brought this map for the first time to the mountain, it was, I think, 2005 now, so more than 10 years ago. You can see here, I found this map, this reproduction of the map in a very kind of obscure publication by the National Board of Antiquities of Finland, where the map was held. And so you can see at the time I went to a copy shop in downtown Berkeley where I was studying, and I made copies of the publication that had the map in different sections, and then I just glued it together. And so I brought this map with me thinking it would be really useful to be able to see the sites using this map. And to my surprise, not only was I interested, a lot of pilgrims there were also very interested, and they were overwhelmingly Tibetan Buddhist monks and also lay people who were on pilgrimage at Mount Wutai. They were so excited to see this map that we just spent all day, many days looking at it, transcribing, looking, and I think this visiting monk here actually transcribed the whole inscription for me because he also wanted to know what it said, all the details, and it was kind of this very important moment for me. It was this moment of connection. I felt like I was doing something that was recognized as, I brought an object that was recognized, right? And that they wanted to see, they hadn't seen before, because even though the map was originally made on the mountain, the prints were no longer available. And so everybody wanted to see this map. And so the next time that I visited, I brought all these I made a lot of copies against copyright laws, of course. I made a lot of copies and I distributed them to the monasteries. And I made copies of large ones, and I made copies of small ones. Nobody wanted the small, the placements, because they wanted to know what it said. They wanted to use it as a guide. And also, sure enough, when I went back, a lot of the sites that were on this map, they were already overgrown because the sites were forgotten, this map hadn't been seen. But once this map went back into circulation, lots of the sites then became revived as pilgrimage sites. And so then I started to think about what this means, right? That this was kind of an important object that was somehow forgotten, but not forgotten because it was recognized. And so what does that history mean to the contemporary pilgrimage culture? And so I don't want to keep on talking, but I just want to show you a few details of this map that gets at this the narrative of 17th to 19th century Mount Wutai, where this became an important site for Tibetan Buddhism. What does that mean, right? So here are some details. Here is a very important site called the Cave of Avalokiteshvar, or Guanyin Dong in Chinese, where the 6th Dalai Lama is believed to have meditated. It's one of the lores, right? So instead of having died or been deposed, in fact, the legend has it that he came to Mount Wutai, and this is where he meditated. And that legend isn't written in many sources, but just a few sort of his biographies. But it became a legend that is remained very popular here in Mount Wutai. And you can see here the cave where this is the Avalokiteshvara, where the Dalai Lama is understood to be an emanation of, and you can see him, this monk in red robe, the 6th Dalai Lama in meditation. And you can also see monks at the time propitiating to or paying homage to the cave and the Dalai Lama. So things like this are fill the map. All these kind of local legends that were important, legends that then tie it also back to Tibet and to Mongolia, which is why I think this is such a sort of interesting period, is how this mountain at this time become linked to the larger map of sacred geography, to Tibet and also to Mongolia, to Inner Asia, and also to India. Here's another detail here of this of this mountain. This is one of the sites that I've heard people are starting to go back to now that they know where it is. It's a site where it's called a Mahakala mountain. Won't get into the history here, but again, a kind of important site that was forgotten, that has since revived. So that's sort of my projects, is to think about how these objects in some ways mediated not only how the mountain was seen, but also how the mountain came to be seen, right? So they're kind of active agents in reshaping the sacred geography of the sites. A few more pictures I'll kind of breeze through. Different maps that are based on the same map image. This one is actually in the Potala Palace. That was probably based on a map that was brought back by the 13th Dalai Lama when he visited Mount Wutai back in 1908. But you can see the sort of tradition the tradition of the imaging the mountain continuing. I also included here a few pictures of other things that I discussed in the book. This is an interesting case study of this one Tibetan text, a guidebook to Mount Wutai that was translated from a classical Chinese guidebook, a Chinese record. And the sort of translation, how do you translate, how do you render a sort of classical Chinese record into the Tibetan language and make it intelligible? And right now, in fact, there's an English language version of this Tibetan translation of the Chinese text coming out for pilgrims. So something to think about as kind of another object to aid pilgrimage and to shape understanding of the site. A few other things, also temples and replicas, temples that were created to mimic ones at Mount Wutai as another sort of site of mediation. So that's pretty much what I have as a way of introduction. So.
Great. Thank you so much for that. It's totally fascinating. And I will say that I'm basically going to hang back in this conversation mostly because this is not at all my expertise, and I also have to kind of apologize ahead of time to say that my career, I was a journalist, and so my tendency is always to kind of bring things into the modern age and try to see what the relevance is and what the meaning is today. So I may sort of jump in with a few questions about that, but then pretty much I'll let you guys carry on with the conversation. But if I could just open with one question about Wen-shing, you were talking about, I mean, it's so fascinating, the idea of the maps which had been forgotten, and then you bring them back, and then you suddenly rediscover all these forgotten places and all this stuff. To what extent, when did that all get forgotten? Was it the Cultural Revolution? Or was this something that went on for centuries, that things were forgotten? I mean, how, and then of course I want you to talk about what happened during the Cultural Revolution, but I'm really curious as to what happened. Why were they all forgotten?
Right. You know, it's easy to forget things, first of all.
Not if you're Buddhist, a Tibetan Buddhist.
Right, so the site itself, the book covers the sort of period of the height of Tibetan Buddhist pilgrimage culture there, which sort of kind of went into, I guess, decline by the late 19th century, even though there was still quite a large number of Tibetan Buddhists there. But really, I think with the sort of end of the Qing period, with the sort of end of imperial support, we don't see the same kind of pilgrimage culture there anymore. Even though there are kind of sort of supports coming from other places like Mongolia.
Starting when?
So I would say the first sort of breakage from that past is probably the Sino-Japanese War, when the place became very devastated. So 20th century, and then with the sort of coming of subsequent to that, and of course the Cultural Revolution, a lot of things were taken, right? People, this is a period when all the monks were either forced to renounce their monasticism, or forced to marry, or suffered, right, and died. So already the site was had not a whole lot of living monastic culture.
Did they continue going, and were the pilgrimages continuing even after 1949, though, from 49 to say 60 to the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, or did that basically stop?
There were pilgrimage and monastic activities at that time. Yes. And there were also not only Tibetan Buddhist monks, but also, this is something Gray has also studied, there were also Chinese Buddhist monks specializing in Tibetan Buddhism, teaching at Mount Wutai as well.
During the modern era?
Yes.
Wow.
20th century. Some of the first Chinese monks, they went to Tibet in the 1920s, and when they came back, one of them, prominently named Nandai, died on the mountain.
Can you hear us, the microphone?
Right before the during the Cultural Revolution, but and he had a strong center there that was part of the revival, but because he lasted there until the Cultural Revolution, and then as soon as things opened up, they started opening up again, and so the Chinese monks who were on the mountain had a connection, I think, to the Tibetan Buddhists who were coming back to the site.
So can you, Gray, you I think started studying or visited earlier than, I'm just remembering the photographs I've looked at, right? You started visiting earlier than Wen-shing. So can you, and maybe we can go through, I'll let you guys now take it away, go through your photographs, but what it was like when you first saw the place, what was happening at that time?
Yeah, so when I first went, so Wen-shing and I share a common mentor named Rector, and he'd been going to the mountain probably from early in the 1980s, I would say.
So the photograph, I think, of this cave on the right, the Buddha's Womb Cave, is from 1986. So he kindly shared, he wanted to very much be here, but he teaches at UC Santa Cruz. It's a mid-quarter, so so he sent us instead some of the old photographs that he's taken.
So I was lucky enough to be a student at Princeton University when he was actively going there, and as soon as I graduated, I headed over there in 1991. And you know, the revival of there were very few Tibetans at that point. Some had started to come on pilgrimage, a very important figure, Eugene Punso, who has, he founded probably the largest religious institution in the world in Kham these days, 10,000. There he is.
Is this him up on the right-hand corner?
That's right.
Okay.
But for the most part, the Tibetans would come in the summer and leave. So there were only a few ethnic Tibetans there for when I first started in 1991. But there were a lot of Chinese practicing Tibetan Buddhism. Some from Manchuria, some from Mongolia, different places like that. But some of the temples were still ruined at that time. They were. I have pictures. I should have sent you one of these. All you could see of the former monastery was the flames on the wall, and the image that had been in front of the flames, with that as the background, were destroyed. And then by the probably 1994, I see Lauren Hartley. We were studying Tibetan Studies librarian from Columbia University. We were studying Chinese together in Beijing and went up to the mountain for a weekend. Just like the lamas used to do in the Qing dynasty, to get away from the heat in Beijing.
So how far away is it from Beijing? Wutai Shan, how do you get there?
It's 150 miles.
That's right.
Is it hard to get there?
I mean, in the old days you do.
Yes, for how close it was. It is. Yeah.
Even into the late 90s, you had to take an overnight train.
Okay.
And, you get dropped off in the middle of nowhere at dawn, and you would have to, make your way up the mountain. I mean, I think it's gotten, but the last time I left, I went through Taiwan and Shenji, and then we got on an air-conditioned bus on a highway. So it was quicker to get back, but.
I don't know if anybody's been there recently. I know the airport was being built. I don't know if it's been built yet or if it's been, so this is one of the big.
Took the train.
Yeah,
But in the 80s and 90s, presumably, I'm guessing that you talked to monks, etc., and they were still very much in recovery mode, or what did they kind of talk about what they'd been through, or what?
Not at all.
Okay.
Yeah, no, that wasn't the topic that I felt comfortable asking.
Right,
certainly.
right.
But it was, in those early days, we stayed in the monasteries. I think there was one hotel. There were no working showers anywhere, and we stayed in the actual monasteries. And I don't know if that's still possible.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's still a possible option amidst lots of five-star hotels.
It's a big tourist section.
So that's, let's walk through the history of then over the decades, what has happened to this place, what you guys experienced there.
Sure, so these are just a few photographs I threw in of this very incredible pilgrimage that was taken by Khenpo Rinpoche from Eastern Tibet in 1987. So this is the sort of time where there was really not much going on there at all. He led this amazing pilgrimage there with all of his disciples. They say tens of thousands. I still can't get a good number, but there were a lot of people, and you can see even the little photographs that we can find. And the site, that visit, the 1987 visit, became pivotal in the sense that pilgrims now, disciples or other people in the lineage or just other devotee, go there to the sites where Khenpo Rinpoche experienced visions. And this is one of the sites. It's the site on the eastern terrace, the Narayana cave. And these are the offerings they make to Khenpo Rinpoche. And you can see his pictures being enshrined there. So in a way, there's this kind of, so he's revived something, and people continue to
And is he someone that the government is perfectly comfortable with?
He passed away in 2004 under kind of sort of dubious circumstances.
House arrest in a hospital. He was getting too
So
popular.
in other words, the relationship with the government was not so great.
Well, he was careful, and he didn't. I think he and his disciples were careful not to make too big deal, even to his death. And so the disciples now, they can come and visit Columbia. They're still running the monastery. Every once in a while, some buildings are destroyed. They say for sanitation reasons. It is. There's a lot of people there.
It is the biggest Buddhist university institute in China. Would you say that?
Which,
by far.
The one that he founded?
The one that he founded.
10,000. people.
I just showed, because since if we're going to talk about it, I have a picture of the institute
Yeah.
at the very end. But the slide seems to be going at its own pace, so we can get a preview. It's wonderful photograph.
How often does that happen, the lights in the sky?
Not often.
I mean, it's very rare. You got
Yeah.
to see it, you were very lucky to see that, right?
Yeah.
Let's go there. Let's go there.
I mean, it's clearly happened in the past in the sense that it's reported since the Tang Dynasty. That kind of five-colored cloud in the sky is reported. But the figure, I mean, I was lucky enough to have an old Canon A1, right,
Wow.
with a time, a handheld timer. So I just happened to be in the right place at the right time to catch it. And like you, when this event happened, it was, the monks had an explanation for it. It was the anniversary of the death of Nanhai, this figure's main disciple, and all these people had come together and they said that's what it's for, but no one caught an image, no one caught a photograph of it. No, we didn't have digital photography, I think, in 1991. And so it wasn't until I went back to the mountain, maybe in 94 or 97, that I brought images, and people, like, as with your map, people were very excited to have the image.
So have you seen this image enshrined in?
I haven't. I mean, at that point, they were just kind of passing it around.
Is that a time exposure?
Yeah, just enough to catch the that's what it looked like. But I had to hold the lens open for maybe 3 seconds to let enough light in. It was so this is something called a fire rainbow. If you Google fire rainbow, you'll see other images like this, and it was much brighter. The rainbow quality was much brighter, but the sun was setting, so we're looking to the west, and the full moon was rising. So the sun is hitting high altitude ice crystals, and then the moon is kind of brightening the clouds from this other side as well. So it was getting light from both.
What time of year?
September.
Was it very cold?
It had snowed a few days before, but Mount Wutai is 10,000 feet, and this was probably 1,000 feet above that. So this is pretty high altitude ice crystals we're talking about.
Is this what
So this
basically
is-
made it a pilgrimage place to begin with? That this is like a supernatural, this is Manjushri appearing, and this is what created it as a place of pilgrimage from the start, do you think? Or
I mean, that's the argument that people make. I mean, they call it the Purple Haze Mountain in some accounts. So there were mystical appearances.
Right. Yeah, so this place was recorded to have been a kind of sacred mountain before it was understood to be Buddhist, and so certain qualities of the site, no doubt. It was understood to be a purple palace, right? So kind of alluding to a place where immortals practice. So yeah, I think these kind of magical displays of light very much adds to it.
You also get St. Elmo's fire on this mountain, again, because of the high altitude. If there's storms or electricity in the air, it attaches to things like the stupas or other objects.
What does that mean, St. Elmo's?
St. Elmo's fire is a kind of, mostly you see it on ships, right? Has anyone heard this term, St. Elmo's
I've
fire?
heard of the term, but I don't know what it is.
like a reverse light.
Yeah, it's a kind of electrical charge that climbs up the masts of ships and lights them up. And in environments where there's no other place to discharge the electrical energy. And the fact that this is, at 10,000 feet and probably the highest point, in this part of Asia.
It is the highest point in all of northern, in this part of Asia. And it's also just, I think, geologically a very special place. This place is known for two groups of scholarships. One is geologists, right? And then Buddhist studies,
And
religious
you saw
studies.
the weather towers
Right.
there, right? On
Right.
that last image.
So the Buddhists, to what extent are their practices and beliefs identical to what they were when you were writing during the period when you were
You mean right now?
working? Yeah.
Well,
And have they had to kind of relearn them, or how does it get handed along despite political disruption?
Mhm. Well, there are also many different types of Buddhist practices throughout time. So, of course, the one group that was really prominent during the Qing period that I cover are the Gelugpas. In fact, they are the very ones who were responsible, supposedly, for not letting Khenpo Jigme Phuntsuk stay on the mountain for as long as he could. It's a Tibetan sort of thing, because he belonged sectarian rivalry. He was a Nyingma, a different sect, different kind of cultural traditions as well. And so, but the Gelugpas, who were very prominent because they were this is the sect of the Dalai Lamas, who were the ones who were patronized by the Qing emperors. They were primarily sort of the people who had most sort of representation on the mountain. And today now the same is true as well. But it's not a continuous practice by any means. The one monk who I have over the years gotten to know, he came to Wutai Shan when he was 9. He was born in Ando, and he, I think, wanted to hitchhike to India, but didn't know any better and ended up on Mount Wutai. That's how he stayed since. And I think as a boy, and then some Westerners came, right, during this period, and there's one woman who basically paid for his monastic education, higher learning, sent him back to a Western woman, came to Mount Wutai, they got to know him well, says this little boy needs an education. So she sent him back to Lanzhou, the Buddhist academy there, got his degree, came back to the mountain, and he's responsible now. Not only he has a lot of disciples, he also is responsible for all the ritual protocols and all the sort of offerings. I mean, he's the one who kind of instituted them. So that's his background.
And I guess I have 2 questions. One is, can you talk a little bit about the ritual protocols for people who aren't totally immersed in the Buddhist traditions? And secondly, I want you guys to back up and talk a little bit about sectarian rivalry, which again is, something that people don't know. You know all about it, but the rest of us don't necessarily. So first about the rituals. Are there any that you can share with us?
Gray, would you like to say anything from the time you've been there? Or?
I mean, what I've seen in this image here, you see the monks going down the mountain, and there was another image of the monks assembling together at Shantong Monastery.
Before, maybe after.
So here you see all these, the red-robed Tibetan Buddhists, the blue, black, and brown are typical Chinese Buddhists, and then the yellow robes are usually Tibetan Buddhist, but of Han or Manchu or Mongol origin. So what you see are kind of shared ritual activities. These monks are doing, and Shantong is the main monastery, kind of administrative seat in the site. So they, this is an effort to kind of share in a certain practice, but there are very different religious traditions that, potentially could be conflictual, right? Chan Buddhism is not the same as Tibetan Buddhism, and the emperors in the Qing dynasty had to sort of tread this path carefully, and different ones took different approaches.
But you mentioned sectarian rivalry specifically in terms of this one particular...
The Nyingma versus the Gelugpa in the late 20th century.
Yeah.
This is a rivalry that also goes back to the imperial period, the Qing period.
And was it, when you talk about rivalries, it's essentially political factions, or is it really because of...
Sponsorship is important, right? So there were, the Zhangyao Rope Dorje, the man who started translating this guide that Wen-shing has worked with people to translate. He is blamed for killing through ritual activity, at least by some people, the Karmapas. They were, the Qing court was interested, especially one of the emperors, was it Kangshi's son, 17th son, was really interested in the Nyingma tradition, or the red hat, which included the Kagyu tradition, and he invited these lamas, the Karmapa lamas, to come to Beijing, and they both died on their way there. So now, you can ask.
Mysterious circumstances.
Mysterious circumstances, but.
Yes, even in his own biography, there are reports of him conducting rituals to cause harm somewhere. So it's that's very kind of known practice. Yeah. in terms of today, I'm looking. I think this. I mean, that's really kind of there has been quite wonderful contemporary ethnographic scholars who have really worked on what the contemporary practice look like, and looking at teachers' lineages. Esther Bianchi is one of them, and what they're doing. So I think I can't speak with authority, but I do have a few pictures in addition to what Gray has of just kind of, you know, you can call, what is a kind of, let me see if I can get there, of ritual activities. These are just a few early morning pilgrims at main monastery. This is another photograph.
Are there certain different, if you could just pause for a second, are there certain different times of day when certain things are supposed to be happening?
Yeah, every monastery, whether it's a monastery that hosts visiting pilgrims or a monastery where monks are in residence, they have a daily schedule of morning, you know, 早课, 晚课, morning assembly, afternoon assembly. Sometimes it's chanting, sometimes it's meditation, different things. But they, every monastery, every religion kind of has that schedule. I guess it's not so different. The first time I went to Mount Wutai, I went with a Catholic nun, and she was able, and she's from northern Shanxi province. Her hometown is Mount Wutai. And she was able to, she just brought her own prayers and read along, and participated in all of the rituals all day long because it just made sense to her. And so, yeah, so it's that kind of monastic life. It's part and parcel, part of monastic life. Here, the pictures of these things that are increasingly happening where wealthy donors or just like donors come and sponsor some sort of offering ritual. Here's a fire offering at these temples that are explicitly sort of Tibetan Buddhist rituals.
So you talked, when we spoke earlier, you talked a little bit about some of the wealthy Chinese who have come to this place, or they come to this place and view it as kind of like a gateway. You said because there's something about this particular approach to Buddhism that they find easier than other approaches, whatever. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, even in the period that I write about, Mount Wutai was known, I didn't mention this, it was dubbed as China's Tibet. By one of the emperors. So you get this idea of a gateway, and I think in today it's a different history, and that's why I don't try to kind of talk about both, because I think it's important to recognize the difference more so than the continuity, even though there is a very strong continuity. The difference has to do with how the government relates to Buddhism, essentially, and how that what the sort of culture that engenders. But today you can have there are a lot of the Lama, who is the person that who I when I go I visit, he has a lot of disciples all over coastal China who come instead of going to Tibet, they come to Wutaishan. And I think there's this kind of appeal for what Tibetan Buddhism can offer them.
And has it become in some ways kind of chic in some quarters? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Definitely. I mean, if you think about what it dates back to the Tang Dynasty, right? China's sort of golden age, and the Tibetans were coming there even that early. They took maps back to Tibet in the Tibetan imperial period, and then the Qing Dynasty again, it became a really strong site for imperial worship and so forth. So there's a lot of history that gets built into that. When I was on the mountain, probably in 1997, I met figures who were coming out of Tibet, painters, statue makers, and so forth, and they were so busy, rebuilding these monasteries, and they were being invited to places like Tianjin that, you wouldn't think, I mean, probably there had never been Tibetan Buddhist monasteries before, but in
They were building monasteries in Tianjin.
That was when they were heading from Wutaishan, they were heading to Tianjin to build out of mud massive Tibetan Buddhist imagery, right, like Manjushri. So it's this intersection. I mean, I think that's the key thing about Wutaishan. It's this intersection of Chinese and Tibetan culture that makes sense to people, right? Manjushri
Why
is
is that? Yeah.
Well, so for instance, Putuashan, which is off the coast near Shanghai or Ningbo, talks about the figure Guanyin or Avalokiteshvara. But the Tibetan version of that deity is the Dalai Lama, and he lives in Mount Wutai, which is what they call it, Putuashan, right? But those don't overlap in the same way, right? They're kind of rival centers, Lhasa and this island off the coast near Ningbo. But Wutaishan places merge, right? So the respect for Wutai and the honor that the emperors have showered on that place for centuries, I think gives it a kind of cachet, and it, it's a comfortable place for Chinese to go.
Right. There were, competitions as to where Manjushri and where Wutai Shan was. I would say up until the 12th century, maybe, and so there were competitions, writing places that claimed themselves to be the vote, but it pretty much stopped after a while, and so this became the place where it's a shared site for anybody wanting to visit Manjushri, which is a pan-Buddhist deity of wisdom, arguably the most important one for across traditions. Mount Wutai is associated. That's the site. There's no dispute anymore. There are creations. Khenpo Jigme Punsuk, for example, when he went back to his institute in Kham, he consecrated a surrogate Mount Wutai behind the hills of the institute, where people can go on a pilgrimage to Mount Wutai, but it's a surrogate pilgrimage. It doesn't replace Wutai Shan. It's sort of to.
Does that count? Do people feel okay with
Yeah,
that?
because it's about spiritual efficacy. So it's advised that those students who are on break, they can go there on pilgrimage, but it's not a replacement. It's a surrogate. It's a substitute. Yeah.
So are you now seeing, so in these photographs, it looks like it's, what I'm seeing is mostly real monks and, serious religious people. But are you also seeing lots of pilgrims or some pilgrims coming from, the East Coast, whatever? I think you talked about students now coming and, non-monk.
Well, of course, you can be a serious pilgrim and not be a monk,
Yes.
right? Or
Yes,
not even
sure.
have a sustained practice. You can just be serious
Sure.
or sincere, right?
Sure.
But there is also, because it's the deity of wisdom, for all the children who have to take the college and high school entrance exams, if they can, they try to make it to Mount Wutai to propitiate to ensure and they usually go twice, once for high school, once for college, and sometimes the ones who come in Thanksgiving 3 times. And so that's a kind of popular, when you tell people about Mount Wutai, they're like, oh yeah, I went there once, and it's fond memories because they're usually so busy studying exams they don't get out much, except for this one trip that they took.
Wow. And did they usually go with their parents?
The ones I've met have gone with their parents, but the ones I've talked to, I don't know who they went with. But I've definitely seen a lot these days from Beijing, these four-wheel drives, going all the way from Beijing, going up to Mount Wutai, and to make a trip, and then make a weekend trip.
Oh my gosh, wow. Okay. And was that, since you were saying this is the god of wisdom, so was that in ancient times also a place where people wanted to pass the examination, the imperial examinations? Did they go there? Is that a crazy question?
Direction of research. It's very interesting because in Qianlong, in the tankas, I don't have pictures of that depicts the emperor as Manjushri. You have a sword and a book and a sword, and there's been observations made about how that also equates the Wen and the Wu, the sort of literary and the martial. So maybe there are some connections. I haven't read of any anecdotes, Gray, have you, of people wanting to do well on their exams and going to Manjushri?
No, in a way I can't quite imagine it during the Qing. Like there was a kind of divide between the Confucian literati. I mean, in the personal life they might practice Buddhism, but I can't imagine them saying, I'm going.
Right.
That would be considered uncool to do that.
I'm just guessing. I mean, in the Song period, the literati would go to the mountain, out of respect for it. But I think in some ways it may have been a little polluted by Tibetan Buddhism in the Qing for the Confucian literati, I would guess.
Right, yes. There is a lot of, and the reason why I turn to these maps and images is because overwhelmingly in the Chinese textual sources, it's largely negative criticisms of how the lamas ruined the place.
Oh, really?
And it's very sort of
in what
Sino-centric
sense? You mean
narrative.
just, okay, so talk about that a little bit.
Because the Qing instituted basically religious leaders to control the whole mountain. Ethnic Tibet. Can you imagine that? Right? So
Explain that again?
Ethnic Tibetans were Mongols being in charge of Chinese territory, right? This is not.
They were not happy about that.
I mean, the Chinese literati who would be writing these
So So then the Qing sent their own military to guard the place?
Well, they send religious leaders, basically. So sort of, these are religious officials,
Like
essentially.
Buddhists?
Buddhist
Yeah.
officials. And there probably was a lot of corruption going on as well.
No. Corruption in China? Impossible. Impossible.
And so, but there is also just a lot of this is even we call Tibetan Buddhism lamas, and even in the English language, right? It is a derogatory term that doesn't recognize it as Buddhism. I think to some extent it's true among the Chinese Buddhists too, to not think of Tibetan Buddhism as a kind of legitimate form of Buddhism. And so there's a lot of negative attitudes and characterizations of this. Yeah.
So then, okay, so just to follow up on this, I'm trying to follow what happened then to the Tibetan Buddhists during the Qing dynasty. If the Han were then sort of disgusted by what was happening.
Or jealous.
At
Right.
Wutai Shan, so what happened? Did the Tibetans stay there?
Yeah, so the
Or were they
Qing,
cleared out?
yeah, so this is very interesting. So the Qing, after the Qianlong emperor, the height of the Qing Empire, they then went into kind of all sorts of internal trouble in the Opium War. It was the central government could hardly keep up with so many other things, let alone sort of promotion of this sacred mountain. So that waned. The imperial support almost immediately waned by the early 19th century.
Was that good for the Tibetans? In the
Well,
sense that no
that's
one was
very
paying attention?
interesting. So all the monasteries that were receiving all the donations all of a sudden had to look elsewhere to survive. And they looked to Mongolia. So all these wealthy Mongol nobles started to become important patrons. And so there's this kind of second wave of flourishing of the site through this kind of Mongol lay pilgrimage. And in some ways, very significant. We have also from the 19th century lots of Westerners who then already went there and observed how these monasteries that had Tibetan monks or Tibetan Buddhists or Mongolian monks were the most popular monasteries, that were the wealthiest monasteries because they were receiving these donations.
At what time was that?
In the 19th, throughout the late 19th century. So it's monastic. So in terms to survive, they looked elsewhere and succeeded. So there was still a kind of a large population of pilgrims and monks as well.
I'm again interested in the idea of you bringing these objects that you've been studying kind of back for Tibetans to look at when you go visit Wutai Shan, etc. Are any of those objects still there, or are they coming back, or
So one monk, I think I even showed a photograph of him. He proceeded to the next year publish a book based on the map. I mean, a very diligent person. There's been other issues, but he looked at the map and he published a guidebook. And so with all the sites, everything described using other sources that he corroborated. So yes, there were, and then there was awareness, and I went to Mount Wutai. I travel fairly frequently, and I also try to go to local conferences where there is. Sometimes they're organized by the tourism bureau about strategizing how to promote tourism, but I try to be there because I want to show something else about the history of the site, and so there was a lot of more awareness, and so the blocks are still on site. Just hidden. So
the what are
the blocks, the wood blocks of the map are still at Mount Wutai.
Where?
It's just in a kind of undisclosed location because during the Cultural Revolution, it was just everything was pretty much destroyed, and this one got saved. And so the person didn't actually want me to disclose the location, but I found it. And so it was very interesting to know that there's stuff, and I go and I still find wood block prints here and there. They're still there. You can find them, and I think people have an awareness now of yeah.
And inscriptions and paintings on rocks. I've been hiking in the wilderness. It's 125 square miles of wilderness in some ways. And I found Tibetan inscriptions on rocks, carvings of Buddhists. And I saw them in 1991. They were digging out a Mahakala image that clearly they had just banked up soil against the rock to hide it. And in 1991, someone remembered and had dug it out.
Wow.
The same with a lot of images that were buried. I don't know how or when, through their practice, but they've been unearthed more and more now. So it's interesting. There's more things there, coming up.
And so I want to open to questions from the floor, but I can't help myself as a journalist to sort of ask you a little bit more about what's going on today. So the kind of resurgence of Buddhism in China these days. Can you talk a little bit about what role it's playing? And we mentioned corruption, and we talked about
The championship will be played on July 19th.
Sorry. Somebody's listening to us. We talked a little bit about political disruption and the challenges that has faced Chinese society as it tries to rebuild new moral foundations and all that stuff. Can you talk a little bit about what role Buddhism is playing these days?
Yeah, I think that fits very well with the ideas that, and you were talking about the coming speakers you're having to talk about this kind of return of a moral universe to China. And I saw it early on, even in 1991. I mean, the people who were, some of the people that I met at the monastery had gotten a good university education, but then they felt like the world didn't have much to offer them in a kind of communist, this is just coming out of the Deng Xiaoping reforms, and so they retreated to the monasteries, and then the lay people who were coming to the mountains had an incredible devotion, and it's connected from my own research that I was speaking of earlier to this idea that religion in China, the Buddhist monks and Buddhist practice in China proper had lost a lot of vitality, and in the 1920s and 30s, all these lamas were traveling to China and doing rituals to save the nation from the Japanese and so forth and so on, and
It had lost its vitality because of war and disruption and things like that, or because of what?
I think Chinese, Holmes Welsh had written about this. I think Chinese Buddhism had become a kind of religious practice that was mostly devoted to like mourning the dead, and kind of not a vibrant tradition. So there was a very important monk named Tai Chu who tried to bring in sort of new influx of thought from Pali Buddhism, Pali texts and Sanskrit texts and Tibetan Buddhist and even Japanese tantric texts.
This is in the early 20th century?
Early 20th century.
Wow.
But the one that stuck, and the disciples of his that really made an impact were the ones who went to Tibet, and they became regional study specialists, much like Fairbanks and Reischauer and people like that went to war in Asia and then came back and founded, Ted DeBerry here in Columbia, founded regional studies in America. These monks founded regional studies institutes that serve the state, that advise the state. How do you deal with that?
In what place?
First in Chongqing.
Oh,
and
in
then,
China.
Yeah, in China. These Chinese Buddhist monks went there felt like they were going to India, Tibet was the new India where Buddhism was flourishing. But when they brought back this knowledge, the state also realized they knew a lot about Tibet, and the state had been cut off from their connections. So there's a sense.
So those scholars didn't have very happy endings, did they?
Some of them survived into post-cultural revolution, and one of them helped found the Chinese Buddhist Academy in Beijing. So it wasn't all bad.
Mm-hmm.
And their disciples, even the ones who died in the Cultural Revolution, their disciples persisted and made important contributions afterwards.
Mm-hmm. And back to what you were just saying about finding some kind of spiritual or moral new foundation for society or whatever, are there these kinds of scholars who are kind of consciously and actively working on that and talking about that?
The lamas are scholars in their own right. They're called Khenpos. It's kind of an abbot or a degree that they get at this Larangar institution. Have incredible followings. I had an email from a guy who went to Veda as an MBA, who's there studying the Tibetan Buddha. He's learning Tibetan and he wants to come to America and get a PhD in Buddhist studies because that MBA that they got at Veda, just didn't mean anything. So there's that. It's continuing that tradition, I think.
Are you seeing the same thing? What are you seeing,
I
Wen-shing?
think the sense of authenticity is the greatest.
User.
I think the sense of authenticity that's associated with Tibetan Buddhism is important. So definitely that's what I see as well. There is there's these kind of very serious practices, and I think there's also on the different level kind of an appeal of Tibetan Buddhism for people who are maybe less serious practitioners as well.
Like an American, right?
Exactly.
Sort of an antidote to the commercial,
Right.
superficial
the
world that
Hollywood,
we live in.
yeah, or the Hollywood, the same kind of appeal that Tibetan Buddhism has to Hollywood, right? So yeah.
Right. Okay, so let's open it up. I see a hand back there.
Wen-shing.
Can
First
you
of all,
introduce yourself first, please?
I'm Michael Lobel. I'm very happily a colleague of Wen-shing Chou's at Hunter College. I just had a question going back to the map, and it's sort of an art historical material culture question. It's obviously the original. Was a large, and you say some of these woodblocks, the actual woodblocks are still in existence, but was the size and detail? I'm assuming it's hand colored. Was that common, or does that signify that that was a really luxe, specialized object, the map itself? And would there have been multiple impressions of it? And
Thank you for this question. It's the question I had. So as an art historian.
So the question is, was the map, was it usual for a map to be so colorized, right?
And to have this kind of large scale, to have this large wood block, have it be hand colored and where there are multiple versions. I didn't see a second one like this in the sense of the scale, and I think it was a feat. It was a feat because how to capture all of the almost 200 sites out there, the apparitions, right? And there's even a legend associated with the creation of these blocks. I don't have a way of verifying it, but the monastery became associated with these blocks. So by the 19th century, when people went up to Mount Wutai, they would go to each monastery and then they would get something special. They do their donations, right? Their offerings, and the monastery would give them something back in return. So this monastery is maybe given some sort of special local mushrooms, and that monastery is maybe given some sort of special locally carved wooden bowls or something. And this monastery, where the carvings are, they were given a print of the map. And so the pilgrims who went there, who wrote their journals would record receiving such a map. Of course, not colored, just a block print. And I even was able to find copies from local villagers whose grandparents they were receiving them because of donations to the monastery. The legend is that a lama, a local ruling official lama at the time, his brother was jealous of the position he had, and so it goes into corruption. So he attempted to murder his brother when they went on a big parade on the big procession on a high hill. He wanted to basically push his brother off the cliff. So this is the legend, right, I'm talking about. And but what happened at the moment that he was pushing his brother off the cliff is that he saw in his brother, instead of the brother, he saw a deity appearing. And at that moment he repented. In order to repatriate, right, in order to kind of make up for this kind of terrible intention, desire, he created this map as a way to kind of make up for that. So this is interesting. Whether the story is true or not, we cannot comment on. But I think to have that story that is necessary to account for what happened here is important. And your next question is even more interesting because you think, how long? Why did it took me 10 years to write that book? One of the reasons is I keep finding these maps and they keep coming up, and all of the versions look completely different from one another. They're the same block print, but they're hand-colored in such a different way that each print would interpret a story differently. And they're all over the world. In every place where there was ever a explorer, spy, person going to China, there's a map of Mount Wutai. In every place in Japan, there are lots of them. In China, they're in abundance. All the libraries have them. Lots of galleries have them. They show up in Asia Week here and there because people have them. And so it's enormously popular, well circulated, and individuated because of that sort of capacity of it to be colored. and to sort of interpret it further. So that's one of the things that kept me going, because I just keep finding them.
Joan,
The tradition of the Sacred Mountain,
Joan Cohen, art historian.
the tradition of Sacred Mountains is a very old one, and Wutai always was designated as one of those special mountains. That was before the Tibetan Buddhists started inhabiting that mountain. So, do you deal with this intersection between it before the Tibetans discovered it? It was discovered. I mean, it was one of those mountains, and it dominates the whole region and continues to today.
Yes.
And there are no high rises there. Taller than it, and I'm sure it still has that kind of color.
Yeah, it does.
So the question is just Wutai Shan was Wutai Shan even before the Tibetans
Oh, absolutely.
were there, and so.
And that's one of, right, thank you for that question. There has been, there's been quite a lot of, as far as sacred Buddhist mountains go, Wutai Shan has well-deservingly received a lot of scholarly attention. And surprisingly, however, when I started this, besides Gray, perhaps, everybody's focused on that medieval period. Thinking about Wutai Shan as this kind of quintessential Chinese pilgrimage site vis-a-vis India. So it's the one place where you can claim it to be Chinese. But the truth is, as we look further, I don't know that it was ever Chinese in the sense of our idea of homogeneous Chinese. It was, even from the very beginning, it seems Northern Wei was when Mount Wutai became a sacred site, and as we know, Northern Wei rulers were not, they were a kind of Tuoba people who were coming from the north, and this place. So it's very interesting. Each time that Wutai Shan became a very sort of thriving center of imperial pilgrim patronage, it was often patronized by people who were, by our standards, now not considered proper Chinese. And so it's always, the site has always been a kind of sacred site in northern China that has been patronized by many different groups of people. And I think the Tibetans certainly also were very interested starting in the 8th century. And so they didn't quite make it to the mountain in the same large number as later period. Does that sort of, so in my book, I try to sort of walk us through that history, but also to kind of emphasize how we perhaps need to think of a different way. We need to think of a different way of thinking this place as a liminal place, not something that is sort of the homegrown Chinese site, so Chinese site vis-a-vis Buddhist India, but a site that was always kind of in flux and kind of intercultural in a way.
Are there Chinese, Han-Chinese scholars who will be shocked by that interpretation? Or, I mean, is that controversial, or is that basically accepted?
I don't think it's controversial, whether it's maybe not attended to the same way. I think it had, in China, in fact, it would not be surprising. I think it's here where we tend to label things Chinese more homogenously, unfortunately. But in China, of course, local Shanxi people will not think of whether they're Chinese or not. There are many influences from Inner Mongolia that is just part of their language. It's just part of their culture. So it's much more in flux and much less pigeonholed.
More fluid, yeah. Did you have anything you wanted to add to that? Okay. Questions? Please, go ahead.
My name is Peter Crosby. I'm a reformed journalist. But before that, I rode a bicycle from Beijing to Wutai Shan, stayed in the Golden Pavilion in 1994, and was treated as an honored guest and able to eat with the monks and able to pray with the monks and able to take photos, video, etc. Is that welcome still available for outsiders? Like, you're both outsiders.
Go ahead, jump in.
Well, I haven't been since 1997, so,
Okay.
But it was certainly still, I felt very welcome there at that time. And my impression is you have as well.
Yeah, I definitely feel very welcomed. There's that. There's also this. I'd go by myself, even though I'm an art historian. I go and research. My agendas are not very fixed because I'm not, going to museum collections or, storage or some sort of survey of a site. I'm there to kind of get a feel for things. And often I end up meeting all sorts of people from all over who are pilgrims. And it's really like going on a pilgrimage. You go to these different sites and you meet people. And then there's this one cave where it's called there's a picture Raoul has where there's this very narrow hole. It's called a Buddha's womb cave. Buddha's mother's womb cave, and you go in there and you come out there reborn, but only if you can fit. And so it's very stressful for people. It's a very highly stressful experience for pilgrims, especially if you're not really slim. And so they have also.
I had to take my belt off to get it.
Can we find the picture?
Yeah, there's a picture, and there's a picture on the map too of this midwife pushing people, and they have midwives pushing people in and out. And so I go there, and of course you come out of the cave reborn with 4 people that you're in the same. You see the cave, the hole in the back here.
Yeah.
So you go in these places and you're stuck in this cave with 4 other people. And then you come out, and then it's this incredible experience. And so yes, you do feel very much part of the pilgrimage landscape.
And I think one of the important things that you mentioned early on is really true that people still feel that monastery can appear in any form there. So the first time I went, we met she said she was a Russian Mongol woman. She'd been robbed on her way there, and they took her in, and they were taking care of her, and she traveled. I think she went to the Buddha's Mother's cave with us one day, and we were all kind of treated as if we all might be monasteries. Kind of what it felt like, the welcome that you got there.
And you do the same, right?
And then you do the same to
do
everyone
the
else.
same to everyone else, right?
Wow. Another question? I see one over there. Yep.
Okay, I'm Lina. I'm the librarian. And I went to Wutai about, I think, 33 years old, 33 years ago. And that time I went over there, I was a little bit surprised because that time the monks much more than the tourists. And they all wear the same color clothes. And that time I thought I went to some army camp because all around is the monks. And I was following them go to see how to eat or something. But that time I found that I saw your pictures. They all wear like a greenish clothes. But this picture I saw seems no one wear that kind of color. All of the like the burgundy red and the yellow. Is that means that time they pour something or the different position they wear the different. Because after that I went to the Hutuo. Over there they totally different. Over there I can feel right away they are much more rich, much rich. So all the stuff on the outside look different. So I know they changed that the different Chinese say the jiaxia is that have meaning something.
Do you know?
I don't know.
I asked that same question of historical photographs, for example, of the opening of the Famen Monastery. When
Where is that?
This Shanxi. What year was that? It was 18. It was around the same time. I think around the same time that they discovered this underground crypt. And it was there were not a lot of monks hand on hand, but they had to perform some sort of ritual when they opened the crypt to these Buddha's relics. And the monks looked like they really just found some roads. And I wondered about that. I think it probably just has to do with what was available. This early period, it was just Buddhism was just starting to become allowed again. And so, what to wear probably was not the first thing. Now they do. Now it definitely. So you would have the same monastery. Now even at Wutaishan, certain monasteries would have different groups of monks living there, monks and nuns, and to distinguish themselves from each other as belonging to different sects, they would wear different color robes. So probably something was happening then too. I don't know. But now certainly the different color robes is a sign of identity of which kind of group they belong to.
Also by age, right? I think oftentimes the older monks have different colors or different layering.
Other questions? See a hand over here?
You
Can
mentioned
you identify yourself, please?
Dan Wasserberg. You mentioned these luxury hotels.
Yeah.
Does that mean that in Chinese society that visit to the mountain now is seen as a status symbol, it's something that they can sort of use as a...
So luxury hotels, does it mean that this is, it's becoming some kind of status symbol to visit Wutai Shan?
I guess maybe not luxury hotels, just by local standards, luxury hotels. So just
Running
hotels,
water.
hotels that are comfortable.
But is it becoming, it's an interesting question,
No,
though.
no,
Is it a
status
status thing to say, hey, I've been to Wutai Shan, if you're an entrepreneur in Shanghai? Or a millionaire in Shanghai?
Tell me, I don't know. Maybe you
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So you don't know.
I mean, the other one is a status, maybe if you have visited certain high lama or high monk, that you can claim.
Right, okay.
Or you get your
Questions?
photo for the Gao Kao or
So-
Wei-shing, right?
So
Different
I-
on WeChat. And so,
Another question, hand up here.
Yes, my name is Thomas Cole. I'm also an interested member of the public. I wanted to ask you, elaborate a little bit more on the lay practice of Buddhism, whether you see all the people here at these gatherings. Is there a significant people who are lay practitioners? Because I know lay practice is important in Chinese Buddhism, and whether these monks try to actively or maybe not so actively get these lay visitors, people who come here more for tourism, to be involved and knowledgeable about Buddhism.
Yeah, I mean, I can't say, generalize, but certainly there's a lot of lay Buddhists, and throughout the decade that I've been there, there are places in China that are called Jushiling, which are literally translated as layman's grove. Places near monasteries or at monasteries where laymen can stay at and study, and pretty much, live like, if you don't take the monastic vows, you don't take the initiations, but you basically study Buddhism. And so at Wutai Shan, there are a lot of, whenever I've traveled and stayed at monasteries, I've often stayed with people who stay for a long period of time there. And 3 years ago when I went back, there's this new wave of people, I think maybe they're millennials, I'm not sure, they're younger than me for sure. And they have come from all over China. They go to Mount Wutai to open vegetarian restaurants, and they live together like a kind of group. They're lay young people who want to be on Mount Wutai, who want to study Buddhism, and they make a career out of it by opening restaurants together.
And are they sort of educated people from the cities?
I would say these are young people. So I was there at a conference at a monastery, and this group of people they took care of us because they were the sort of local hospitality business, and they were basically young single people who were there on Mount Wutai working, and because they're attracted to the site.
That's fascinating. There's definitely a movement of young, educated urbanites who have, decided to move back to the country, basically move into small villages, that kind of thing.
Right.
So
So maybe it's related to
yeah,
that.
fascinating. I see a hand way in the back, and then this gentleman's next. So I think this is going to have to be our last two questions.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
So my name is Wen-shing Chou. I'm a PhD student in Sino-Tibet history at Columbia University. So I got one question for you.
Is he your student? Okay.
He just passed his oral exams today, so he's heading off to the 2 years of funding to do field work.
wow.
Thanks for your nice talk. So I got one question for you. So as an art historian, how would you read those stone inscriptions in Mount Wutai? Because as a historian, when I was there, I think most inscriptions exist nowadays are mostly in Chinese and Mongolian.
Correct.
So
Yeah.
I couldn't find too many things, too many inscriptions in Tibetan. So
Right.
how to explain the leadership?
Yeah, so that's very interesting. So another art historian, architectural historian, Isabel Chauveau is the one, I'm sure you're familiar with her work, but to everyone else here, she's also been traveling to Mount Wutai all these years, and she's found every single, she would go behind bushes and try to find these inscriptions and photograph them, document them, and translate them exhaustively. And thanks to her, we have a very good picture of what these inscriptions are about. They're mostly Mongolian, she's a Mongolist, and they're mostly they're mostly 19th century. And so the fact that they are not in Tibetan has to do with the period that they are, because it's mostly Mongol patronage. And this has to do with the period that I was talking about, where there's no imperial sponsorship, but lay Mongol patronage. There are Tibetan inscriptions, and they are from the Qing, from the earlier period, very often. And they're often not Tibetan inscription per se, but quadrilingual or trilingual inscriptions in Tibetan, Mongolian, Manchu, and Mongolian. And so,
wait, but no Chinese.
Yes, Chinese. Sorry,
Chinese
yes, there's Chinese. Usually there's Chinese. So it's either trilingual in Mongolian, Tibetan, Chinese, or quadrilingual Manchu, Mongolian, Tibetan, and Chinese.
Wow. Okay. All right, so we have time for one more question. This gentleman, you had your hand.
Yeah, I was curious.
Can you introduce yourself?
Oh, Adam Klayman, former scholar.
Once a scholar, always a scholar.
Not for sure. I'm curious, your focus on maps is very interesting. Are there maps about the function of Wutai in a larger sacred geography context? Because I'm interested in sort of pilgrimage, what the roots mean in terms of the relationship of the places where people are coming, and how does Tibet figure in? Because this is fairly distant. And so I'm curious about kind of maybe you can comment from Tibet, and yet that kind of conduit makes it kind of an interesting history. So I was just wondering if there's any maps or kind of historical precedent about the pilgrimage as a sort of historical relationship.
Yeah, there are route maps.
Can you sum up the question?
Yeah, so the question, if I understood it correctly, is whether there are maps that maps the relation of Mount Wutai to the larger sacred geography. And the answer is yes, but not probably the one that you would like to have in terms of knowing how to get from point A to point B. There are, I would call them cosmographical or cosmological maps, where Mount Wutai is painted in relation to a set of other sacred places, whether it's mythical places or real places. In Mongolia, Mount Wutai is depicted with the great monasteries of Lhasa. So it's a kind of monastic learning center, and that's a kind of a kind of mapping of sites. In Tibet, we have depictions of Mount Wutai existing in this kind of cosmography in relation to Potalaca, India, Bodh Gaya, Udayana, and Shambhala, these kind of mythical or kind of hard to reach places. That's just what. And so, yeah, so there is this attempt to kind of fit it into this larger sacred cosmology, for sure.
Well, so I want to thank you for bringing us through the sort of magical and mystical history of this region, and then also for this, journalist bringing us all the way up into the modern era. It's really fantastic, so interesting. Thank you so much. Next Thursday, we have another fascinating talk, which I hope you guys will come to as well. Bill Porter, who is an expert in Buddhism, Tang poetry, Chinese language, all kinds of Chinese philosophies, is going to be speaking here about the tradition of the hermit. And he's just returned from a recent trip to China, where he was wandering the mountains of China, hanging out with the modern day hermits of China. So please come back next Thursday, but thank you for coming tonight.